next speaker is Dr. David D. Friedman. He's an economist and legal scholar. He's well known for his work on anarcho-capitalist theory. His most famous book is The Machinery of Freedom, which outlines a world where societal functions are produced by the market, such as including law and security. This approach differs from many libertarians by focusing on cost-benefit analysis rather than natural rights. His other works include Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, Law's Order, What Economics Has to Do with Law and Why It Matters, and Hidden Order, The Economics of Everyday Life. He's certainly a multifaceted individual. He holds a Ph.D. in physics, and he's also very active in the Society for Creative Anachronism, where he's engaging with medieval combat and cooking. He has 2 talks for us today, covering market failure for one, and I don't know what the second one is.
You'll find out.
But yeah.
The next one is, I think I'm calling it the market for law, and the next one is about how you could have a stateless society. But I want to start out, I gather from what I heard of the first talk, that a good deal of what you're interested in are markets, or more generally, self-generating orders, systems where what happens is not the result of a human being having designed it, but the interacting acts of a whole bunch of different human beings. And in that context, the concept generally mislabeled market failure is a crucial issue, because it's the issue of under what circumstances do individuals acting rationally produce the wrong result. And as I think I will hopefully persuade you, figure out this does not seem to be working.
Let me try again.
There we are. The market failure is and is often used as an argument for government intervention in the economy, but is also, I would argue, even a stronger argument against government intervention in the economy. The basic logic of the situation is that market failure shows why the free market that many of us are in favor of works imperfectly, but the same reasons imply that the alternative to the free market generally works more imperfectly. Yeah, sorry. And I will be explaining what market failure is, why it is an argument against laissez-faire on the free market, but also why it is a stronger argument against the alternative, basically because market failure, the conditions that create market failure are the exception on the private market and the norm on the political market. And I want to go on to suggest that market failure is relevant to a whole bunch of other things in life, including marriage, teaching, war, how to make money. And I don't think I'm going to do the pandemic one this time. I did that last time I did this talk. Technical terms sound self-explanatory. So you are inclined to say market failure means markets fail. And they usually aren't. My standard example for that is the theory of relativity, which sounds as though it means that everything is relative. And for those of you who have taken the relevant physics, you may realize that one of the things the theory of relativity tells us is that the speed of light is quite impossibly absolute. That is to say, the speed of light is the same whether you were moving the same direction of the light or the opposite direction. That's obviously impossible. If this were a lecture on physics, I would explain it, but I'm not going to. Similarly, market failure ought to mean situations where markets fail. But in fact, there are ways markets can fail that have nothing to do with market failure. And market failure happens in lots of places other than markets. It is, in fact, a general problem in coordinating human activity. What is it? Market failure describes a situation where each individual is acting rationally, and the result does not produce group rationality. That's, I think, the simplest way of thinking about it. That it's tempting to say, That's part of the reason why there are going to be failures on the market that are not market failure. Namely, a failure on the market that comes through irrational behavior, people making mistakes. You might think of something that comes through ignorance, maybe insoluble ignorance, as a failure in a sense. The market doesn't predict the future. But the market failure has to do with a particular set of reasons for failure, where each individual correctly acts in his own interest and all of us are worse off as a result. Because my act helps me but harms you, your act helps you but harms me. That's the basic logic of it. It is not limited to markets. My standard example that I'm very fond of is to imagine that you're somewhere in Europe, somewhere around 1100 AD, and you are one of a line of 10,000 men with spears, and they're all pointing that way, and coming at you are another 10,000 men with spears, and we call them lances because they're on horseback. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say to yourself, if all of us stand our ground and keep our spears solid, with luck we can break their charge. And if we break their charge, some of us will die, but many of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. Sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him, the guys on either side of me. I only control me. If everybody else stands and I run, one man out of 10,000 isn't going to have a significant effect on the chance of stopping their charge, and I won't be one of the people killed stopping it. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever everybody else does, it's in my interest to run. We all run and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. My second example, which is less exotic and which I've actually observed, in fact I've observed not terribly far from here, just south of UCLA, where there is an intersection of two roads, which I used to be told back when I was teaching at UCLA was the busiest intersection in the world. Probably there's some place in China that's busier nowadays. And the pattern you observe is that the cars on Wilshire keep going across, with the result that when the light changes and they're still trying to get across, the intersection is jammed with cars going that way. Gradually they filter out, just in time for the cars going the other way, westward if I remember correctly, to fill the intersection that way. Right? So everybody goes home slowly because everybody has to wait for the intersection to clear from the people who've gone across. Everybody would get home faster if everyone was polite and didn't come into the intersection until he was sure he could get across it. But any individual who behaved that way would get home later because he's giving up the opportunity to get across and he's providing a benefit for people coming the other way, not for himself. So that's a very unexotic but quite familiar example of market failure. All right? We don't call it a market, but the logic is exactly the same. You've got a bunch of people each controlling his own behavior. And the result is worse than if they did something else, even though none of them are making a mistake. My third example is one you may have also observed. You're in a restaurant, and you're talking with your friends. Unfortunately, the other people in the restaurant are talking to their friends too, and that makes it a little bit hard to be heard. So, of course, you speak a little bit louder to make sure your friends can hear you, and all the other people in the restaurant do the same thing. And eventually, you're all shouting and nobody can hear anything. Again, your behavior is rational. If you politely kept your voice down and the other people behaved as they are, you don't control them, you would be even worse off. Nobody would hear you even for the first 5 minutes. But nonetheless, the result is worse than if everybody politely kept his voice down. To some extent, we solve that kind of problem with norms. But that would be another topic. In any case, those are examples not in what we usually think of as markets. part of the reason this is interesting is that there is a simple argument for freedom that feels intuitively right, and I want to claim is not right. And the argument is each person acts in his own interest, each makes the decisions that maximize his net benefit, that maximizes the sum net benefit, so there's no need for government to intervene to change what people do. And that's an argument that libertarians are tempted to make, and it is one of my long list of bad arguments that libertarians shouldn't make because they're wrong. You should try to have good arguments for your position instead of bad arguments for your position. And what is wrong with the simple argument should by now be obvious, that sometimes I get the benefit of my act and you get the cost. Examples would be air pollution, dangerous driving, etc. And therefore I might take an action even though the cost for all of us combined is larger than the benefit for all of us combined. We call those negative externalities. And sometimes I pay the cost and you get the benefit. Radio broadcast, basic research, and so forth. So therefore I might not do the action even though the benefit is larger than the cost if you include the benefit of other people. We sometimes call that positive externalities. We sometimes call it the public good problem. Public good for an economist does not mean a good that the government produces. It means a good such that the producer can't control who gets it. There's a second definition which I'm leaving out because it's not as important. So if you produce something you can't control who gets it, you can't charge people for it, therefore they get the benefit. You don't get the benefit, therefore it doesn't get produced. Unless you're very clever, which we'll get to in a little bit. So there are sometimes solutions to these problems. Some externality problems can be solved by putting both parties under the same roof, as it were. So if you think about a shopping center has an incentive to provide free parking, which is a public good from the standpoint of the person providing it, but it raises the number of customers who the people who the shopping center is renting space to can get, and therefore increases the rent they can collect, and therefore you are converting what would be a public good into a private good. Similarly, if you think about a restaurant, a movie theater that would be better off if there were a late night restaurant near it, because the customers could go before or after the show. And the late night restaurant would be better if there was a new movie theater next to it. And one way of arranging that is that the owner of the mall, when he decides who to rent to, takes account of all such interactions because they ultimately raise the rental he can collect. So that's an example of a externality problem, public good problem that can be solved privately. Another example that we're all familiar with is that it's perfectly obvious that radio broadcasts would never be produced privately because after all, the broadcaster can't control who gets it. Oddly enough, they are produced privately. And the explanation is that some unknown genius, at least unknown to me, thought of producing two different public goods, one of them with a positive cost of production and one of them with a negative cost of production, and tying them tightly together and giving them a bundle. And the public good with the positive cost of production is the program, and the public good with the negative cost of production is the advertisement, because companies will pay the broadcaster to put on the ad, so for me it's a negative cost of production. And as long as the combination has a positive value to the customer, you can give it away and still make money. So that's an example of a way in which sufficient ingenuity can produce a private solution to a public good, market failure, whatever you want to call it. I think of market failures as having a bunch of categories in which public good and externalities are the most familiar ones, but there are some others the economists know about. However, the critical point is that there is no guarantee that you can always do this. There's no guarantee that individual rationality in a market will always produce group rationality. And you should therefore expect that that there are times when a sufficiently wise dictator could make things better. That government could step in to improve the situation in both directions, to improve it by regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, making us all better off by preventing acts whose costs are larger than their benefits, and similarly it could subsidize things like radio, television, basic research, making us all better off by producing acts whose benefits are larger than costs. But there is a problem with this, and the problem is that this requires government to do the right things. And in order for it to work, we need some mechanism that gets government to, in fact, make the right decisions. And putting it in, from an economist's standpoint, we need some arrangement such that the private interest of the actors in government, that people in government are human beings too, actually aligns with the general interest. That's what you want. Some way that the rational choices of political actors, you're political actors too, assuming you vote. In a sense, if you don't vote, that's also a choice. Some way that they will add up to rational choices for the whole polity. Otherwise, government intervention could make things worse instead of better. That's the basic logic of the argument. That brings us to the obvious next step, which is market failure on the political market. Because if you think about it for a while, you realize that most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. Sometimes they pay a bit of the cost, sometimes they receive a bit of the benefit, but there's no mechanism, unlike the ordinary market mechanism. On the market, if you produce something and it's not a public good, you get to sell it to people, and so the benefit largely goes to you. If you want to produce something that requires input, you've got to buy them, so you're bearing most of the cost. And therefore, to a first approximation, you don't have market failure, and the second approximation, you do. So most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. And let's start with you. I hope you're all rationally ignorant voters, because that's the rational thing to be. I actually did the experiment when I was teaching a course that covered some of this stuff at Santa Clara University, of asking the students in the class whether they knew the name of their congressman. And half of them did, roughly. And it's very hard to do a good job of deciding whether your congressman is doing a good job if you don't know his name. But there's no reason you should, because if you think about it in terms of your interests, unless you're very benevolent, you will say to yourself, well, figuring out whether Trump or Biden is a worse candidate requires me paying a lot of attention. That, oddly enough, neither of them says I'm the bad guy. As far as I know, nobody has introduced to Congress a bill labeled a bill to make farmers richer and city folk poorer. They, in fact, routinely have such a bill. It's called the Agriculture Bill. But that's not how it's labeled. On the contrary, if you really go into it, you will discover the supporters of the bill have all sorts of complicated, clever reasons why raising the price of food makes you better off, which is basically what farm bills are typically. I may be out of date, at least back when I knew something about what they were typically designed to do. You as a voter, it would be very costly for you to actually have a rational opinion on whether Biden or Trump is the worst candidate. And you would get almost no benefit. That the benefit from getting the right answer to that question is maybe a change of as much as 1 part in a million of the chance of who wins. Probably less than that. Actually, you're in California, so it's much less than that. Since California is an overwhelmingly Democratic state. But even if you're in a swing state, you might get the odds of your vote changing the outcome. That is, of changing the outcome of the state and of the state changing the outcome of the election as high as maybe 1 in 20,000, 50,000, something like that. It's not worth making a very large investment in time and effort for that benefit. So in fact, there are going to be some people who think it's fun to try to follow politics. There are going to be many more people who correctly believe that supporting the same person who the other people who matter to them support, their friends, their neighbors, will benefit them much more than supporting the right candidate. Right? Because after all, the benefits you get by having the people around you think well of you are private benefits that you don't get. That's the sensible thing to maximize, as it were. Similarly, a legislator passes a bill, provides costs and benefits to others. Lobbyist benefits his customers. The judge, there is a particular case, which I can go into if people are curious, we have time later, where some judges made a decision that almost certainly killed something in the hundreds of people, probably more than 100, more than that, probably maybe in the thousands. The effect of the decision was to delay the introduction of vaccines. This is a long time ago, by a year or so. And the decision was based on a mistake in mathematical reasoning, which a smart high school student should have been ashamed of. They were basically comparing the annual cost of one thing to the lifetime cost of the other and saying, well, they're about equal, so you might want to think about what you want to do. That's another story. It's one of my stories I'm fond of. But in fact, a judge makes decisions whose costs and benefits go up. And he probably doesn't even know if he's made a bad decision. I've got a longer. This is basically going through the stuff that I just told you. Sorry. All right. That's pretty obvious. And that means that they support policies that sound good, or if I've written this outline today, this is modified from a talk I gave at some point in the past, then maybe they do the ones that their friends like. But either way, or even the ones that are being supported by a candidate who looks nice, or who feels like somebody would be fun to ally with, or feel important, or things like that. And similarly, another effect is that you tend to get short time horizons. That people who are arguing for government doing things always say, well, look, the market is too short-sighted. But if you actually think about it, the incentive to bear costs now for benefits on the future depends on the person who bears the costs now getting the benefits in the future. On the market, that's mostly the case, that if you fix your roof today, it won't leak next year. Indeed, on the market, it pays to make investments whose payoff is past your own lifetime. Because after all, if I plant a field with hardwood trees, which are slow growing but valuable, I'm thinking of black walnut, which is a very pretty wood, even though I'm 80 years old and it's going to take 30 years for those trees to mature, I can still get the benefit because 10 years from now when I'm 90 years old, I can sell that field to somebody else who's younger for the increase in value due to the fact that they're 10 years closer to being mature. So that means that on the market, you generally have an incentive to take account of long-run cost and benefits, not cost and benefits to other people, but cost and benefits to yourself. But if you think about the political situation, politicians do not have secure property rights. They don't have secure property rights in their political power. That, as I said some elections ago, some presidents ago, Clinton could rent out the White House rooms, but he couldn't sell them. So it is therefore not in his interest to care very much about things. And in fact, if you really look at what people are paying attention to, what they're worried about is what's the unemployment rate going to be at the next election, or the inflation rate, depending on what they want. And they pretend to be interested in the future because voters can't see the future and therefore can sometimes be fooled into accepting real costs now for imaginary benefits. The champion of that particular approach was Joseph Stalin. He could not plausibly tell the inhabitants of Moscow, living a family to a room, that they had good lives. But he could, for quite a while, plausibly tell them, these are the sacrifices we are making so that your children will be richer than the Americans. And eventually it breaks down, but it works for a while. But if you look at what they do, they are mostly interested in the effects of the next election. Stalin didn't have effective elections to worry about, but he had his equivalent of that. Think about the trade-off for a regulator between allowing a drug which ends up having bad side effects, which will get publicized eventually when they're discovered, and postponing the approval of a drug because it might possibly have bad side effects. All right? There's a trade-off there, as in most uncertain decisions. A regulator who permits a drug that kills 20 people is out of a job. A regulator who delays a drug killing 100, there's no cost because statistical deaths are invisible. Maybe some scholar will discover them at some point, but the fact that your cure rate is, with the old drug, is 80%, and with the new drug it would be 85%, that's a lot of dead people, but you're not going to see. I like to cite the, I can't remember the number. There was an FDA press release a good long time ago in which they confessed to killing, I think, 100,000 people. They didn't put it that way. What they did was to say they had decided were now going to approve beta blockers, which were drugs that were used to prevent a second heart attack, which had been in use in Europe for quite a long time. And they had an estimate of how many lives would be saved. Well, it followed from that during the period when they weren't permitting them, that many lives were being lost unnecessarily. And I think it came out to 100,000, as I remember. Anyway, but you can see that this is not people making mistakes. This is rational behavior by people under a particular set of institutions. Another interesting effect, and I think that Gary Becker was the one who originally spotted this one. Think about public good problems in lobbying. Suppose that somebody has the idea of having an auto tariff, a tax on importing foreign autos. This will benefit the auto companies, and it will benefit their workers. Their workers are represented by a trade union, United Auto Workers. The companies, I don't remember how many there are at the moment, but these are companies producing in the US, so let's say 4 or 5 companies. It will also probably benefit the mayor of Detroit and maybe the governor of Michigan. Those are places where lots of cars are produced. So you've got about 7, 8 actors who will share the benefit from this thing. Well, one solution to the public good problem is to get the actors together to agree, I'll pay this much if you pay this much. That's workable with 7 or 8 people. It's not workable with 300 million people. All right. The cost of the tariff is going to be borne first, most obviously, by the customers of people who buy cars, because cars will be more expensive. Second, less obviously, by all producers of export goods, because if you import less, you export less. We go in that if this were a class on that subject, which it isn't. So you're talking about something which benefits maybe some hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people, but those people are represented by 8 actors with a reasonable incentive to act for their stockholders and their union members and so forth. And it injures about 300 million people. So if the benefit is $1 billion, well, make it easier. The benefit is 100 million and the cost is 200 million. Beneficiaries could probably raise more than $10 million to bribe the politicians to pass it. And the victims cannot raise anything like that amount for the other side. And if you actually look at the litigation, look at the lobbying over this, who is it who lobbies against the tariff? It's the dealers for foreign cars, because they are irrelevantly considered in prison. So the general conclusion is that I listed farmers because agriculture is one of our export industries, but it's all export industries really. That's the argument which I've just gone through, and therefore it is politically profitable to benefit contract interest groups at the cost of dispersed interest groups. So these are all examples of the basic point, which is that on the private market, individuals usually must pay for what they use and get paid for what they produce. But there are sometimes exceptions, sometimes situations where they don't. So market failure does indeed occur. On the other hand, on the political market, individuals almost never bear the cost to receive the benefits of their actions. So have no incentive to make those choices to maximize the net benefit for all. And that explains why, in practice, the market failure does a better job of predicting political outcomes than of predicting market outcomes. That market failure tells us that on the private market, that radio and TV broadcasts won't be produced because they're pure public goods, and externalities won't be controlled. But in fact, radio and TV broadcasts are produced, and externalities are often, but not always, controlled. Compare a large shopping mall to a small town. We're talking about roughly similar scales of people affected, and we know, I think most of us can observe which one is more likely to solve its externality problems. On the public market, on the other hand, the economic argument for protective tariffs was a legitimate argument 300 years ago. And the relevant economic breakthrough was made by possibly my favorite economist, David Ricardo, who I'll say a little bit about in one of my later talks, I think. And he showed why it is rarely in the interest of a country to have a tariff. Nonetheless, most countries have tariffs. And that's a prediction of market failure theory, which I've just run through, because a tariff is a way of benefiting a concentrated interest at the cost of dispersed interest. And it turns out you can actually go further than that. You can, to some extent, explain which industries get tariffs. Partly how concentrated they are, but also for reasons that are a little more complicated, and I can go into if people are curious later. There is a tendency for declining industries to get tariffs and for developing industries not to, which is exactly the opposite of what the assume a benevolent despot we're doing it would do, because one of the standard arguments for tariffs is a so-called infinite industry argument. But infinite industries have very few votes. Gary Becker, another economist I'm fond of, unlike Ricardo, I actually knew him. Ricardo was a little before my time, about 200 years ago, a little over. That in countries where there are few farmers, farm policy is generally designed to raise crop prices in order to get the political support of the farmers. That's the US situation. In countries with lots of farmers, it's usually designed to hold crop prices down in order to buy the support of the urban mob, which is the opposite of the pattern you might expect. I should say that at least as of when I knew about this stuff, the one country, maybe the only country in the world which doesn't do either of those things was New Zealand. I'm not sure why. It's an interesting place. If you're in the capital of New Zealand and you throw a dart at random, you'll get sushi. Yes?
So question, you made this argument that declining industries are more likely to get tariffs. What does that say about our current policy and the trend of America? Like, does that not speak to a level of either like deindustrialization or paranoia surrounding potential deindustrialization?
That's not the reason. That might be effective. No, the reason is, suppose you have a perfectly competitive industry, you impose a tariff. Prices go up. However, just as in other perfectly competitive industries, the firms compete away the benefit because so they're producing at a higher price, but then there are more of them, their costs of production are higher, and so if you have what you really want, if you want to transfer money to an industry, you want an industry which has some fixed resource, which can't be increased, which hopefully, ideally, which is held by not too many people. In a declining industry, think about a factory that was worth building but would not be worth replacing. All right? That factory, when the price goes up, it makes more money. But unless the price goes up enough so it pays to build another factory, you don't have an expansion in supply to bring profits down, as it were. So you have what economists call pseudo-rents, quasi-rents rather, which you get, that in effect the ownership of, that's all right, the ownership of facilities that are no longer worth building is like the ownership of land, something where you can bid up the price and the result will be increased income to the owner rather than competing with other people. And that's both an argument for why farm constraints are in fact more common than usual, but also it's an argument for why declining industries tend to do better in that competition. Let me go on to whatever I have next. So the conclusion, which I've already told you several times, but telling things multiple times sometimes helps, is that market failure is an argument for government intervention in markets, but a stronger argument against once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both. That the mistake, probably the most common serious mistake economists make, is to implicitly assume that they're the government. That is to say, here is how I figure out what would be economically optimal to do. Have the government do it. And in fact, I saw what seemed to me a version of the same mistake in the context of current politics in an exchange I was having with somebody online. And I was raising, as you may know, Trump claims the right to declare a particular Venezuelan gang to be a foreign country invading us, and therefore to arrest members of that gang and deport them to a foreign prison without any trial at all. Right, that's his present position. It's being litigated, of course. I was objecting to suggesting to somebody that might not be a good idea. And his response was, I approve of having illegal immigrant criminals arrested and deported. That is to say, he was simply assuming that it would be done in the way he wanted it to be done, rather than saying, given that the government's got the power to do it, obviously if they're sensible the first time they do it, it'll be the most obviously guilty people, but there's no reason why they should stop, since there is no, as they see it at least, there is no right to a trial or any kind of procedure. So that's the same argument. So the critical thing is to realize, this is also what public choice theory comes out. Public choice theory is the application. In fact, maybe I should have given a lecture on that instead. But public choice theory is the application of economics to the political system, which is what I've just been doing some of. It's saying, if we apply our normal economic assumptions that individuals are rational and self-interested, what are the predictions for the political system? In explaining the concept of economic efficiency as I use it, I usually introduce what I refer to as a bureaucrat god. A bureaucrat god is an imaginary ruler who is all-powerful to make people do whatever he wants and is entirely benevolent. And a market outcome is inefficient if it could be improved by a bureaucrat god. And that doesn't tell you whether it can actually be improved. But if it can't be improved by a bureaucrat god, then there's no point in looking at it. So anyway, that's what I think is a useful way of categorizing it. Market, this is stuff I've already told you, but after this is over, people could tell me whether they think that the PowerPoints help, because I have very mixed views on PowerPoints. That's another issue. Market failure is relevant to lots of other things, some of which probably matter to you. One of them is implied by my first point, that in winning battles, you want to make it in the individual interest of the other side's soldiers to run. So, for example, it might be prudent when you're attacking an army to leave them lines of retreat. Because if they can't retreat, they might as well fight to the death, and you'd really rather have them leave. And that's going to be true in lots of contexts. It also means that you need ways of making it, from your standpoint, on the one hand, you want to apply this to the other side's soldiers, but also to your soldiers. So my standard example, which may or may not be historically right, but is certainly a traditional historical story, is the sacred band of Thebes. This is Greek classical antiquity. And the sacred band of Thebes was made up of pairs of homosexual lovers, no one of whom would ever show cowardice in the presence of his beloved. And the story, which I think exaggerates how well it worked, is that they won every battle they fought in until the last, when they faced an army commanded by by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, later Alexander the Great, and died to a man. But that's one solution, and the version that we get is not as extreme as that, but is to sort of encourage the idea of thinking of your buddies, your group, as your family, and their lives are valuable to you. So these are all a cruder solution, which is proverbial, is burning the bridge you came over behind you. Then you can't run. If you lose, you all get killed, but maybe your people don't run and so you win. These are all examples. How to run a firm. All right. What you want, I don't know very much about it because I haven't run any firms, but part of what you clearly want to do is to set it up so that reward to individual employees corresponds to their contribution. And that may be one of the reasons why you have a firm with a bunch of subunits instead of a single hierarchical organization, because the subunits you can do separate accounting for, and you say, well, your division did well, so the vice president in charge of that division gets a bonus, and maybe the vice president in charge of that division can tell which of his people did what, and so forth. So that would be part of designing a firm. And this is one that occurred to me, given my particular background, and I had a technological improvement on teaching, which I never did, but I think other people have done versions of it. And the basic problem is that I'm giving a lecture in economics, and I come to a pause, and I say, now did everybody understand my explanation of the principle of comparative advantage? And nobody says they didn't. And only when I grade the final, or maybe the midterm, do I discover my mistake. Because each of them said to himself, maybe the other students understood it, and if I say I didn't, I'll look stupid to my friends, and maybe the professor will say he's stupid, don't interpret his exam answers favorably if they're ambiguous, and so forth. So it's in everybody's interest not to tell me. And my solution, which I didn't do, was to have a classroom where under every student's toe there is a button which they can unobtrusively push. And the screen at the back of the classroom shows me how many buttons are pushed. So when I say, well, everybody who clearly understood the principle of comparative advantage, push your button, and the number 2 appears on the screen, and I go back and teach it again. So that would be an example of trying to to solve the market failure problem by suitable innovation. Let me give another one, which is probably more relevant to some of you than others, which has to do with running a household. And the particular puzzle which I like to put to audiences is, suppose that you and your wife both cook, and each of you cook about half the time. And there are two ways you could organize things. One of them is that the person who cooks the dinner also cleans up afterwards. And the other is that one person cooks and the other person cleans up, and then you switch the next time. And which is a more, what are the reasons to do one or the other? Any of you haven't answered that question?
Division of labor.
I don't. Either way, we're both doing half the cooking and half the cleaning.
But why are you dividing it? It's all one job, isn't it? It's making dinner for the family.
But you,
Forgive me.
it's all right. The answer is that the cook makes decisions which affect how much cleaning up is needed. Do you cook a meal that takes one pot or four?
Hmm.
Do you wash one pot while the next one is coming to a boil? If I'm going to clean up after my cooking, I've got an incentive to minimize the combined cost of the cooking and cleaning up. And furthermore, I have more information about the cost because I'm the one who has to scrub that pot after I foolishly let it burn at the bottom. If my wife does that, well, I care about her, but I'm not nearly as much aware of costs that she bears as the costs that I bear. All right. So there is an argument the other way, and the argument the other way is that after you finish cooking, you're really tired and therefore don't want to do the cleaning up, and you'd rather do it the next day. So I don't want to say it is unambiguous. My point is only that the economic analysis of market failure tells you something relevant to the answer to that household decision, which I find interesting. And this is also why we make small children clean up their messes. All right. For those of you who are parents, when the kid is 3, maybe even 4, cleaning up the mess yourself is much less trouble than getting the kid to clean it up. But if the kid is the one who has to clean up the mess, that's a reason not to make messes. All right. So think about market failure as a profit opportunity, which is one of the things that it is. The market failure implies that there is some other outcome that is a net improvement. It follows out that if you can figure out a way to get to that outcome and can arrange to pocket some of that net improvement, you could make money. So for one example, the first version we thought of combining advertisements with radio or television broadcasts. Radio broadcasts, surely television didn't exist at the time, pretty sure. Or the first shopping center. Or suppose you were thinking about creating a search engine, making it available to people online. And you say, well, it's going to be pretty hard to charge people for 3 cents every time they do a search. On the other hand, I could charge people for being found. And that's why Google is a very rich company. All right, so those are all examples of ways in which these ideas are useful not only for political arguments, but for more generally making sense of the world, which is one of the things that's neat about economics. All right, now let me give you my favorite example of designing around market failure. 2 Bedouins are in the desert, a mile from the oasis, and they start arguing about whose camel is slower. The first one says, this snail I'm riding disguised as a camel has got to be the slowest camel in all the deserts of Arabia. And the other one says, Now, you think your camel is slow, this rock that I'm riding on. And they get into an argument, and finally they agree on a bet. They agree to bet 1 gold dinar, gold coin, and whoever's camel gets to the oasis last wins the bet, because that's the slower camel, perfectly clear. And you can see what happens. One of them goes slowly, one of them goes more slowly, because they both want to win the bet. And eventually there are 2 Bedouins sitting their camels stock still with the oasis still a mile away in the blazing sunlight. And at this point, a wise man comes by and he says, "Why are you idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sunlight with the oasis a mile away?" And the 2 Bedouins get off their camels to explain the problem to him. And he says 2 words to them, and they jump back on the camels and ride off for the oasis as fast as they possibly can. The question, of course, is, what are the 2 words? And the answer that some of you who've heard this problem before may already guess is trade camels. Because the bet is on which camel gets there last, not on which Bedouin gets there last. So if I'm riding your camel, I want it to go as fast as possible, and if you're riding my camel. But I like that as an example of the general point that you can sometimes engineer around market failure if you're clever enough. But there's no guarantee you can. So if you want to see lots more stuff, my website is there, and my website includes the full text of a bunch of my books. It includes the full text of a bunch of my articles. It includes a sorted list of my Substack posts, sorted by topic. And there are, I don't know, probably a couple of hundred of them by now. I'm doing a Substack post every 3 days. One of them went out 49 minutes ago because I queued it up this morning. That's on artificial intelligence, and includes a long quote on the effects of artificial intelligence from David Ricardo 200 years ago. He wasn't thinking of his artificial intelligence, but it was the possible economic consequences of technological progress. There's a reason I think highly of Ricardo. Anyway, so that's the Substack. It's free, and you can subscribe to it and get the posts. And then posts are on everything. That is, let me actually, I've got an internet connection. Let me show you my web page. That's my web page. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that my computer's not attached to your screen. Sorry.
It's easier to look up as an
Can you find it?
Yeah.
Why did you put it up there? Because I was going to say that my actually, all you have to do is to click on that. Click on the link. I've got the link right up on the screen. You had that a moment ago. There we are. And now, why don't you just for fun click on the Substack posts sorted, which are right there. And those are the topics: climate, COVID, discovering truth, economics, education, history, household matters, libertarianism, love, marriage, sex and evolution, poetry and literature, politics and law, religion and philosophy, and miscellaneous. And scroll down just so people get some feel for the number of posts. That's just climate, but that's one of the main ones. Didn't have much on COVID. Anyway, so basically, I write mainly to spread ideas, not as a source of income, so I give it all away. One of my sayings is that when you're young, you're afraid people will steal your ideas. When you're old, you're afraid they won't. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
More discussion? I guess we're supposed to be over now, or do we have 8 minutes that we're supposed to talk before we go off to lunch? Any questions, comments, anything?
So as, you probably have a Substack post on it, but you might as well explain. So how do you have like a nicely engineered solution for pollution? I guess because that's
Pollution?
Yeah.
No,
No,
that is to
okay.
say, one of the things that I'll be discussing, I think after lunch, because my third talk I really want to polish. The two of the three talks I'm giving are ones that I've given before and I'm just modifying them for this audience. And the third one is new, and at this point I've got a first draft of the PowerPoints for it, but I'd like to have a few more hours to go over it to make sure it's smooth. So the one that I think I'm gonna go give after lunch is on situations in which all of government functions are being produced voluntarily. And one of my conclusions is that that system will not do an optimal job of dealing with pollution. That in fact, I have you'll get to it, but I'm basically having a discussion of what I think of as market failure on the market for laws. And unfortunately, one of the examples is that you will get a suboptimal level of control of air pollution. But I don't know of anything better. So no. The particular problem that gets a lot of attention at the moment, which is global warming, what I have is not a solution but skepticism. That basically, part of the reason I have so many things on climate is that my view is that we do not have a good reason to believe that climate change will be bad for us. That is to say, climate change will have good effects and bad effects. Because everybody knows that it's bad, they look at the bad effects and make large estimates of those and mostly ignore the good effects. And if you actually try to add them up, as it were, the conclusion is you can't tell. That it is not obvious which of them ends up being larger. And if you look at the literature, you discover that it's very bad. That is to say that, for example, there is an article published in Nature, which I've written a very detailed critique of, which claims to estimate the cost of an extra ton of carbon dioxide summed over the next 3 centuries. If you read it carefully, you realize that one of the implicit assumptions on that is that there will be no progress in medicine in the next 300 years. They never say that, but their calculation, about half their cost comes from increased mortality due to higher temperatures. It's not at all clear that it's even true. If you read it, there is a whole literature on the question of the effect of temperature on mortality, and it's a very hard problem. And my guess is that the people who've done that literature are probably honest, but I don't think any reasonable person would say that you had much confidence in the conclusion. But furthermore, one of the things that mortality has to depend on is medicine. So they're using data from the recent past and assuming that the relation between temperature and mortality will stay the same for the next 3 centuries, until the end of a little less than 300 years now. But furthermore, on their model, GNP per capita is up about 10-fold, 11-fold by the end of their period. That means that incomes are getting much higher. Well, rich people can afford air conditioning and poor people can't. So you would certainly expect that a large increase in income would decrease the relation between temperature and mortality. They just ignore that. And to add insult to injury, they have, I think, 2 paragraphs on reasons their estimate might be too low. They say nothing at all about reasons why it's too high. And this was not only accepted by Nature, which is a very reputable journal. The EPA, back before the election, requested comments on it because they were thinking about using it for making their regulatory decisions. And I should say, this article concluded that the cost of carbon was something like 3 times what the previous estimate had been, 3.5 times, I think. So that's one example, but I've got a bunch of things I have are evidence that the literature in climate science is horribly biased, sometimes dishonest, and therefore shouldn't be trusted. That you have to really, actually my view in general is that published science, you cannot just trust the conclusion. You've got to actually read the article, figure out for yourself Or if you can't do that, find some place where smart people are arguing both sides of it and where they have done it, and see what the reason is to believe the conclusion. Because there certainly is honest science out there, but there's also both, again, this is an economist thinking. There's an incentive to get the views that are currently popular because you want to get tenure. And there is an incentive to pretend to convince yourself you've discovered something new even if you haven't. Because novelty is how you get published, and how you get published is how you get jobs and get promotion. All right, so the way I like to put it, thinking more in economics than anything else, is that you want to discover something that hasn't been discovered before. And false things are more likely not to be discovered than true. So therefore, and given that there are lots of ways of arguing and even convincing yourself that a false conclusion is true, if you look at the various ways of sort of doing statistics, essentially, that means that there is a very real tendency in lots of different fields for people to produce articles which are making claims which, in fact, if you looked at carefully, are not true, but which are novel and which they seem to be able to support. So anyway, that's a broader issue. But one of the things I discussed at some length on the Substack is how to find out what's true. And there aren't any easy ways, but there are some ways of increasing your odds a bit. All right, I think we're supposed to go to lunch.
Thank you.